Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Gina Anderson, Executive Director of the Germanic-American Institute, and I would like to welcome you to today's virtual discussion with Susan Neiman, author of Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Some quick technical notes before we begin. We're going to keep our microphones muted during the discussion, and you can adjust your view settings to your comfort. Please use the chat function to message Germanic-American Institute for assistance with any technical issues or questions. Our Director of Communications, Erin Hart, will be monitoring the discussion, and we can receive your questions via the chat function. For those of you who are joining a Germanic-American Institute event for the first time, let me just say a few quick words about our organization. So the GAI is a nonprofit, and we're located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Our mission is to connect people to a broader world through German language and culture. We host a wide range of cultural events and language classes and invite you to learn more at our website, gaimn.org. And now I am so happy to introduce our guest, Dr. Susan Neiman. Dr. Neiman is the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. She was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and she studied philosophy at Harvard and at the Freie Universität Berlin, and was professor of philosophy at Yale and Tel Aviv University. She is the author of Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin, The Unity of Reason, Rereading Kant, Evil in Modern Thought, Fremde sehen anders, Moral Clarity, A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists, Why Grow Up, Widerstand der Vernunft, Ein Manifest in Postfaktischen Zeiten, and most recently, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Thank you again for joining us. We are so delighted to have Susan with us today. And now I will turn the microphone over to Erin Hart to open our discussion. Dankeschön.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Gina mentioned, this event is more of a discussion rather than a formal presentation. Obviously, this book covers a lot of important topics that are very timely and that we're all very interested in. So I invite you to ask questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we probably won't get to all of the questions, but I will do my best to get to as many and pull together as many as possible. Dr. Neiman, I'd like to start by asking you how this book came about. I understood from the book that you started writing an article and that it grew into a larger project. Could you tell us a little bit more about how your book grew over the years that you were?
Yeah, well, it actually goes back further. I first came to Berlin in 1982 as a Fulbright fellow, thinking I was going to stay for a year and go back. And what actually fascinated me almost the moment I came here was this whole notion of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. For those who don't know German, I translate that as working through the past or working off the past. And really, from the very beginning, I made the comparison to what people were doing in Berlin, not everywhere in Germany, that's for sure, and not even everywhere in Berlin, but large numbers of grassroots groups, artists, intellectuals, church groups were thinking and talking about it and doing things to commemorate. It was just before the 50th anniversary of the Nazi takeover to power. And I said at that time, how come we stopped talking about the Vietnam War after it was over? And why did we never have a national discussion about Hiroshima? So I've been thinking about this stuff for a very long time. And yes, it is true that I wrote an article when I was asked to give a lecture, and I was thinking about this stuff. It actually moved by Quentin Tarantino's movie, and I'm not a Tarantino fan at all, but Django Unchained really blew me away, and also blew away one of my daughters with whom I saw it at the time when it came out in 2014, because my daughter turned to me and said, how are the Americans going to get this? They're not going to get all the German references. That is the first movie that I can remember Hollywood making in which the good guy is played by a German, and you know, sort of German culture is contrasted with the, you know, Deep South in slavery times. So I wrote a piece kind of focusing around that and forgot about it entirely for a good, somebody wanted to put it on the internet. Fine, you can put it on the internet. And I forgot about it entirely until President Obama gave his incredible speech, the eulogy for the 9 churchgoers who were murdered in Charleston. That speech was historically very important. I date that as the beginning of an American Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, because it was the first time that a national figure, much less a president, said, we're not going to get rid of violence in the present until we confront the violence of the past. And listening to that speech, I thought, gosh, I have been thinking about the way the Germans have been doing it for decades. Maybe this is something that there's something going on in the States that I hope I can contribute to. And then at the same time, this article that I had forgotten about, you know, was read by someone in Mississippi who invited me to come and give a talk in Mississippi. And while I was thinking about writing a book, the title was immediate, Learning from the Germans. I certainly didn't want to preach from abroad. I wanted to spend more time in the States, looking at the ways in which those people who are trying to come up with a better, truer version of our history and working on racial reconciliation. So I wound up in Mississippi, long story short. Not because I should say, and you're in Minnesota, which many of us are watching with deep concern and pain at the moment, even on the other side of the world. So I certainly don't think that racism is only a problem in the Deep South, but focusing on the Deep South. In fact, there's a piece, I think, today in the New York Times saying that it's by a Minnesotan saying that it's easier to think that Minnesotans are nice and they don't have racial problems because it doesn't get talked about. In the Deep South, it does get talked about. It's all out there. And so I spent the better part of a year over a couple of visits interviewing people, a huge variety of people, from civil rights icons like James Meredith, or contemporary icon Brian Stevenson, who built the National Lynching Memorial, but also, you know, quite different kinds of people. And I also interviewed a lot of people in Germany, both people who were involved in the process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung and a number of other people who'd been affected by it. So the book is very much written in many voices. That was important to me, to, you know, first of all, have my own voice and my own experience, my own reflections in there, but also not to dominate the conversation, to make sure that contrasting voices were, and contrasting stories were involved as well.
Yeah, I would say that that helps make the book so readable. I think sometimes people get afraid of history books or think that this might be a history book. And to me, the book seems very alive, that you really do tell the backstory about everyone that you interview. So I highly recommend that our audience that reads through the book. I
like books that are alive, and I that's what I try to write. But I should point out, I'm not a historian. I'm actually I was trained as a philosopher, and of course, people are often more put off by that than even by historians. But I'm the kind of philosopher who believes that everybody asks philosophical questions, and that can be made clear virtually to any thinking person.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And you are able to mention some philosophers in your book without making it too scary, and helping us understand those phrases. So you mentioned Minnesota, and I definitely want to circle back to what's happening in our community right now and the issues that we're dealing with. But I wanted to take it a step back for our audience, and I was hoping that you could give us an overview of what Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, what that looked like in Germany. I know that's a big question, but how did it start, and when did it start? In the book, you talk about how the Germans went from seeing themselves as the biggest victims after World War II. How did they go on this journey from victimhood to acknowledging guilt and their role in committing the crimes during the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, one has to say it took the West Germans a very long time. I would say 40 years after the war. That's the first important thing to remember. The second important thing to remember is there were two Germanys, and they did it very differently. East Germany was led by people who were communists, and as communists who were the first victims of Nazi terror, they spent the war either in concentration camps or in exile. And so they were deeply committed anti-fascists. And when they came back to lead their half of the country, they made it very clear, first of all, that more Nazis were tried, brought to justice, taken out of public office. Lesson plans were revised. Children had to learn about the war, learn about Nazi crimes. They renovated concentration camps, and every child at some point in their school years went to Buchenwald. Now, this is not to say, this has been a controversial part of the book, this is not to say that the East Germans did everything right. They did not. And they also instrumentalized their anti-fascism in a number of ways. Nevertheless, what's often forgotten, including in Germany today, is that they were way ahead of the West, with the almost sole exception of Konrad Adenauer, who was not a Nazi. Almost everybody in government and civil service had either been a Nazi or had cooperated in different ways with the Nazis. And there was one German philosopher called it communicative silence. There was a sometimes spoken and sometimes unspoken decision that West Germany was not going to talk about these matters. They paid some reparations towards Holocaust victims and towards the state of Israel, but there was an unspoken bargain. If we pay up, we don't have to do any Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. People that I know who went to school in those years say history just stopped in 1933. It was barely, if at all, discussed. I mean, it depended on the individual teacher and the individual state. But what you had were groups of people, church groups, intellectuals, artists, who round about the end of the 50s began to insist that Germany face up to the fact that actually, yes, it was, it suffered during the war, and they were still coming out of, everybody had ruins, cities were bombed to smithereens, but that actually the real victims, or the worst victims, were elsewhere, and it was the Germans' fault. And what's interesting about this, I do sometimes get asked, was there one thing? No, there wasn't one thing, which in a certain sense is hopeful, and I think also for our own, as Americans, efforts in these directions. I don't think one thing can actually do it. But there was information that got spread. There were the Eichmann trial was more important outside of Germany than within Germany, although it did impress some people, and it was, of course, broadcast. The Auschwitz trials a year later were very important for changing German consciousness. I think travel for the generation that was born either during or just after the war was terribly important, that they realized how they were actually viewed by their European neighbors. And all of this together produced a climate that, at least briefly, could elect Willy Brandt, although it's very important. Willy Brandt is always a hero abroad, and not many people abroad know that precisely the things that made him a good German in our eyes, that is the fact that he, as a social democrat, went into exile almost as soon as the Nazis took power, and was deeply opposed to them, that was actually used against him as a campaign slogan by Konrad Adenauer in 1962. So, and his kneeling at the memorial in the Warsaw Ghetto was not something that most of his compatriots thought was a good thing. So you had this small window with Willy Brandt, but it grew into a wave with a combination of literature, film, and also, even though they dismissed it as communist propaganda, I think the fact that East Germany continued to point out how many West German officials had Nazi pasts had an impact. I just recently read a book. East Germany tried in absentia, of course, Adenauer's right-hand man, Hans Globke, a very important figure in the early Federal Republic, and sentenced him in absentia to life in prison. Now, of course, that didn't happen. But what's interesting is that a lot of the West German press followed the trial and said, well, actually, he should resign. Prison's one thing, but he should resign. So it had an impact. And all of those things pushed together did force an important acknowledgement that Germans needed to see themselves as perpetrators and not as victims, and certainly not as heroes. I should say that I do not believe this process is complete at all. I talk about that to some degree in the last chapter of the book. I would make that even stronger today, actually, due to some controversies, political controversies that I've become involved in the last year. I think that Germans, by and large, certainly 80% of them, feel a genuine shame and regret for the crimes of their parents and grandparents. That doesn't mean, first of all, that they extend in a way that it needs to be extended, Nazi crimes to racism in general, and not simply to anti-Semitism. And that's a problem that people of color and others in Germany are dealing with today. It's also not clear that they know what to do with real Jews. Been saying that the thing that all Germans know about Jews is we killed them, but that's a beginning. It's not, and I think there's often still a certain uncomfortableness, not nearly as bad as it was in the 80s when I first came here, but an uncomfortableness in dealing with a live and intense Jewish community, which is growing here. So it's fastest growing Jewish community in Europe, by the way.
Yeah, you also discussed that in the book, and the growing Israeli community in Berlin as well, I believe. Thank you for that. In the, I think in the book, you also mention the Wehrmacht exhibit
Yes.
as playing a big role, I think, in both East and West Germany. And you'll have to correct me if I'm not remembering correctly. Could you talk a little bit more about the Wehrmacht exhibit and what was so important in that exhibit and consciousness raising in Germany?
So the Wehrmacht, for people who don't know, was about 19 million men strong. And there was a draft on. The only way to get out of the draft was to do something worse, like become a concentration camp guard. So everyone had family members, usually multiple male family members, who served in the Wehrmacht and had to, whether or not they sympathized with the Nazis or not. The Wehrmacht exhibit was opened in 1995 by a private institution, the Hamburger Institute for Sozialforschung, as a contribution to the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. And what they brought into the exhibit was not something that would have surprised historians, which is why the people who did the exhibit were surprised at the reaction. What they simply did was to argue that the Wehrmacht was a criminal institution that regularly killed civilians in fairly horrible ways. They did not focus on the Holocaust. They focused on the murder of 14 million Slavic civilians who were killed by the Wehrmacht in the East. And this was, for West Germans, a shock, because many of them, surprisingly enough, in 1995, were still holding tight to the idea that, well, the problems with the Nazis were a few bad apples in the SS, but my grandfather was just defending his country. And the exhibit was shown in 33 different cities. In one place it was firebombed. In other places there were demonstrations against it with signs saying, Opa war kein Verbrecher, you know, or my grandfather was a hero. So it did shake up West Germany. It did not shake up East Germany at all. East Germans have told me this. We knew this from the beginning. This was perfectly clear. First of all, the crimes in the East, and not just the murder of Jews, were always part of what East Germans had learned, and they certainly learned about the Wehrmacht. But for the West, it was quite an important moment. I mean, I'm trying to go through these things as quickly as possible, just so that people will get to ask questions if they want to. You could, if you were going on for a long time, you could say, well, this is a landmark in, there are other landmarks in the story. But I think the most important thing to remember is there were lots of landmarks. It wasn't just one.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to take 1 second to encourage our 75 participants to enter a question in the written chat. I'm happy to read that for Susan. Otherwise, you'll be subjected to what I find interesting about the book. So I want to make sure that we have a moment to talk, a few moments to talk about memorials and monuments. And obviously that's something that the United States has a lot to work on. Could you talk a little bit about the monuments in Germany? I actually mentioned to a friend of mine this morning that there are no public monuments to Hitler and the Nazis in Germany anymore. And he was shocked. He had no idea.
Well, yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, so if you could sort of compare and contrast a little bit the monument scene in Germany and the United States, and what these monuments represent, and why is that important?
So first of all, as soon as you write something like that down, somebody sends you a letter and says, well, there's one in my so there are a couple, with one exception. They're very out of the public eye. They're certainly not in major places. There are none whatsoever in Berlin. Part of that, of course, is thanks to the fact that the Third Reich lasted 12 years and there wasn't a huge amount of time to build monuments. What there were lots of swastikas on public buildings. There were lots of Adolf Hitler Straßen, you know, practically in every town. And the Allies banned all that. All right, that was a decision of the Allies to say whatever there is left, you know, is forbidden. Once again, in East Germany, they began to build some monuments to the victims, but more importantly, to resistance heroes. That was very important in East Germany to focus on heroes rather than victims, which is an interesting, it's an interesting perspective. But what you see when you go to Berlin today, and I focus on Berlin just because there are nearly 500 monuments in Berlin, and that's not counting all the stumbling stones, which I'll describe in a second. You know, there are more in Berlin, of course, than the rest of the country. But what you see are a quite interesting and often artistically very impressive variety of monuments to different victims, monuments to some of the few heroes that there were. You have this project called the Stumbling Stones, which is absolutely brilliant. It was privately started by an artist, Gunther Demnig, to put little brass plaques about this big in front of the last freely chosen homes of people, mostly Jews, but not only Jews, who were later deported and murdered. And each stone has the name, the date of birth, and the date of deportation and death, if it's known. And there are thousands of them. And what's so important, I think, about those memorials is that they bring home the fact the terror started right where you live. This is not only something that happened off in Poland, or, you know, that you mourn at one central monument. You should not forget that this began as a part of ordinary life and other people not standing up for their neighbors. Brian Stevenson was extremely influenced by the Stumbling Stones and has incorporated the basic idea into his lynching memorial, which hasn't been entirely fulfilled yet, but the lynching memorial is just opened a couple of years ago. So that, of course, is entirely different. There is, by the way, a museum for bad monuments. As I said, there weren't all that many Nazi monuments, but there were certainly a number of militaristic Prussian monuments from the First World War that were taken down. And they're all in this museum in Spandau, where they're taken off the pedestal and they're kind of mixed up. Children are encouraged to climb on them. You're supposed to sort of deconstruct them as you walk through the actual museum. But it's very hard to walk through Berlin without being struck by one interesting monument or another. And I think this is a reproach to people who say, oh, if we tear down our monuments in America, we'll forget our history. No, you won't. And Germans have not forgotten their history, not by a long shot. And one of the points I make, which I think is so important in thinking about the monuments are not about history. We don't memorialize every bit of our history. We build monuments to men and women whose lives embodied the values that we want our communities to have. And, you know, when people start saying it's our heritage, it's our history, you have to say, well, no. Did you put up a monument to your Aunt Gertrude? I don't think so. You know, those were the Confederate memorials were put up. And of course, this is something that I believe all of us learned in the last 5 or 6 years. I didn't know it before that. And I grew up in the Deep South. I thought the memorials went up right after the Civil War, and you figured, okay, somebody's remembering their son or their father or their husband who fell. As a matter of fact, they were put up in 2 distinct periods where white supremacy was on the rise and where people were worried about the civil rights movement. And as soon as you know that, it seems to me, you know, you have an answer to the people who are worried about doing away with our history. There are lots of ways to remember history. One of the things that I think is extremely important when we think about monuments in the US is not just who we take down, because I basically think the Confederate monuments need to go. There's just, if this were a country where I would have to walk past, you know, Nazis in uniform or on horseback or whatever, I doubt that I would have come back here. I really wouldn't have. And I think it's, again, it's not just an offense to Black people. It's giving all of us the wrong message about what this country values. And, you know, having fought a war to defeat the Confederacy and end slavery, it's quite bizarre that we're still glorifying the people who fought on the other side. But I think it's at least as important for us and I hope this would take place in different communities, to think about who we want to put in the place of the old memorials. There are lots of heroes. I do think people need heroes. They don't need to be military heroes. In fact, it would be nice if we could have more non-military heroes, but there are plenty of them. And those discussions need to be going on along with the question of, you know, when are we going to finally take down the Confederate statues in Virginia and elsewhere? They're not just in the South, once again.
Right, yeah, absolutely. We have a question from one of our audience members that goes back to this issue of what happens in communities and how, you know, white and communities of color can come together and talk about racism and reconciliation. So the question is, what sort of scripts would you advise to get these conversations going? And that makes me think about the time you spent at the Winter Institute and how the conversations went that you witnessed. So if you could address that, that'd be great.
Look, I've been quite upset this week, frankly. And I was even more upset when I saw the front page of the New York Times this morning, which said that during the trial of Derek Chauvin, 3 people a day have been killed by police violence. Not all of them, but the majority of them are African American or people of color. I think the first thing that white people need to do is stand up for Black Lives Matter. We did it last summer. And then, you know, there have been some studies now that more than half of the demonstrators last summer were white people. And then the Republicans did a pretty good job trying to win the election by doing a repeat of Richard Nixon and talking about law and order and you know, focusing on the couple of cases where property was vandalized. I feel like there is nothing more important right now for white people to do than to stand up and say, you know what white privilege is? I never had to give my children the talk. I've got 3. They're grown up. I know everybody who has children knows you have all kinds of worries for your children, and you know, anything could happen to them, falling with the wrong crowd, get hit by a drunk driver, God knows what. That's something I never had to worry about. And it seems to me that the first step needs to come from white people in this moment, where despite the fact that Black Lives Matter was the largest numerically social movement in US history, Black people are still being killed at traffic stops or pepper sprayed at traffic stops or whatever, children. So it, you know, it seems to me that this is something, this would be a first step that white people who are concerned about racial reconciliation, I don't know, you know, it's a great question. I'm sort of thinking on my feet. I could imagine if I were in the States, I would almost do a mother to mother conversation, you know, get groups of white mothers. First of all, standing out in public, demonstrations are still important. I still occasionally go to demonstrations. And it matters to put yourself on the street, but it, you know, also matters to try and set up groups. I mean, not to, there's one tone, there's the Robin DiAngelo kind of, we're all miserable sinners and anybody who's white is by virtue a racist and all we can do is beat our breasts and apologize. I think that's not the right way to go. And I frankly don't think African Americans particularly appreciate it. But I think, you know, an outreach in this moment, which is really a precarious moment, would be the first place to start. You know, and I have seen these groups work. It sounds hokey, but I did spend some time, you know, with groups that were sort of about half Black, half white, where people talk about racism, talk about their own experiences of race. They start slow, they start exchanging stories of commonalities, which is very important to build trust on all sides. And then they can talk about the harder questions. But at this moment in American history, I think it's up to white people to do outreach in that way.
Thank you. It reminds me of, or one thing I've been thinking about is when, I think it's Patrick Weems from the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, who says you can't have reconciliation without justice. Do you agree with Patrick?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I don't know why any group that's been persecuted should want to reconcile with the persecutors or the children of the persecutors, unless there's first of all been truth, and with truth, some attempts at justice.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn to another question from our audience. What would you say to the older German Americans who seem to be suffering from Holocaust fatigue, who have an attitude of, this is long gone into our past and we need to move on?
You know, it really depends on who they are, and I'm not going to answer that question straight. The Bible says The sins of the fathers will be visited on the children for 3 or 4 generations. That seems to me actually quite, reasonable, because the repercussions go on. They really do. I mean, look, there's a right-wing party in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, which also says, enough with the Holocaust already. And that's a serious problem. Now, again, it depends both on who the Germans are and how the Holocaust is being talked about. If the Holocaust is being talked about as this is an absolutely unique thing in history that the Germans did, and the Germans were monsters, which I fear is often the way it is talked about in the United States, that's a problem. It's very often talked about with no knowledge of German history. I mean, most Americans will have kind of images, gas chamber, cattle car, but very little information about, how the Nazis came to power, and in particular, what happened after the war, and how many attempts, slowly, fitfully, but indeed in the end, serious attempts were actually made to bring some justice and bring some reconciliation into the world. I am one of those people who believes that anti-Semitism is a form of racism in general, and that it can happen and does happen in many places, even if the Holocaust was the most striking example of murderous racism that we know in history. So I hope this is helpful. I've said that I can't answer. I mean, I can't say yeah or no without knowing exactly what's being said. I do believe that it's important to talk about particularities and to talk about what's moving people either to, I mean, look, let's be honest. It is, and I say this in the book, the Holocaust is sometimes used in America, and by no means only by Jews at all. It's sometimes used as a way of saying, we know what evil is. It's putting people in cattle cars and gassing them. And therefore we can focus on that and not focus on any other forms of evil. And that's a problem if it's being done like that, okay?
So we had a couple of questions about modern Germany, and unfortunately we cannot travel to Germany right now, but a lot of us have been, we're very affected and following the news about Angela Merkel's decision to accept refugees, the very large number of refugees in 2015 from, I believe, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. You mentioned the Willkommenskultur in your book. What do things look like in Germany now, and how has anti-Semitism been affected by perhaps anti-Muslim or anti-refugee and immigrant sentiment in Germany today?
It is sometimes alleged, particularly by the right-wing party, which even tried to recruit me with Islamophobia. It's sometimes said the immigrants are bringing anti-Semitism into the country. There has been a serious study, 96% of all of the anti-Semitic incidents or crimes in the last 5 years were done by right-wing Germans. So this is just not true. The majority of the immigrants or refugees who came in 2015 and the beginning of 2016 are successfully integrated, speak German. Most of them have jobs or in some kind of training program or school training program to get jobs. So it's been a pretty successful integration of the refugees. which nevertheless did contribute to the rise of the AfD, which is a racist right-wing party that, you know, worries about German purity and wants as few foreigners as possible. So, you know, we have not solved the refugee problem. Merkel, as is her wont, you know, sort of foisted it off and did a rather unpleasant deal with Turkey, which nobody talks about very much, that Turkey would prevent refugees from coming here so that Europe wouldn't have to worry about them. It's not a settled problem. However, I have to point out that, you know, if the United States were to do what Germany did in 2015, we would have had to take in 5 million refugees at once on a fraction of the land mass. So it was a generous gesture, and it was very much supported by broad scale swathes of the population. And it's still the case that the last polling data showed there are more Germans actively involved in refugee integration than voted for the right-wing party. And when I say actively involved, these are people who are, you know, giving their time to give German lessons and help with the bureaucracy, or play music or football with children. It was really moving when it happened in that September. My son, who was living in London at the time, he's an adult, he came for a visit, and he's an artist, and I said, well, what would you like to do? You know, should we go, is there an exhibit you'd like to see or whatever? He said, can we do something for the refugees? So I said, okay. So we bought as many, well, our first idea was simply to buy as many groceries. This was very early on. As many groceries as we could carry, and try to bring them to different centers. And people said, we don't need anything else. Everybody has been donating so generously that, you know, we don't need much more. So, and that is true, I know, even in, not just in Berlin, which has a large international population, but also in small towns across the country. So that's been a good thing. Now that's, there was another question. Sorry, I went on. What was the other question about contemporary Germany?
I believe it was the anti-Muslim, anti-Semitism, excuse me, connection.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, there are actually, there are people who say it's my neighborhood. There are more Palestinians and Israelis living in this neighborhood than anywhere else in the world. And it's one of the few places in the world, if not the best place in the world, where they can actually meet in a normal social level with, you know, without different laws preventing them from getting together. So this is not to say I've met them, Syrian refugees who told me that they were brought up with anti-Semitism, and they had, you know, very one-sided pictures, and they'd never met any Jews. But you know, and there's work to be done there. But there are a number of organizations, of Jewish Muslim organizations. There's at least one major theater company that puts on a lot of joint productions between Israelis and Palestinians and other Muslims. So it's a work in progress, but I'm hopeful about that part of.
There's a question here about South Africa's truth and reconciliation process. Are there aspects of that process that you have studied, or that you might find, or that we could find useful to the United States?
So, to my great regret, I've never been to South Africa. And I've read some things about that process. They're quite contradictory. There are a lot of South Africans who do not think that it was a success. And because I'm not an expert on it, I don't want to talk about what could and could not be brought to the US. Certainly what's true, but that goes back to your question about justice, Erin, there won't be reconciliation without truth. And, you know, that's going to be a process that will take us generations. It's started in the US. I would, again, date it to about 6 years ago. But it's going to go on for quite a while because it will and does involve looking at the foundations of the country and the fact that we were welcomed by indigenous peoples initially, who we, in many cases, killed and robbed. And that was policy. And, you know, we are still not keeping treaties with Native peoples. So those are all things that we're going to have to face.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about is I went to a very moving exhibit at the Deutsches Historisches Museum about the German role in Südwest Africa and Namibia. And I was just thinking about their working off the past related to their colonial history and their role and the massacre of, I think, the Herero and Nama tribes. I believe there's discussions going on with reparations, and you know, some have even said that what Germany did in Namibia was the first genocide of the century. So I wanted your thoughts on the Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung in regards to that chapter of German history. Are they doing it?
So that chapter has really just been opened quite recently. But it's quite in focus of discussions, and not just discussions, exhibits, and not just exhibits, but the whole concept of the Humboldt Forum, which is this gigantic museum, which was the Imperial Palace was rebuilt in the center of Berlin. And the funny thing is, well, it's now maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago that these discussions were going on. Why do we need to rebuild the Imperial Palace? Do we even have a function for it? A lot of people were against it. The suggestion that was at the time thought to be politically correct was, well, we'll take all the collections of non-European art out of Dahlem, which is way on, you know, out the city, and we'll put them in the center of town, and we'll bring them, you know, we'll confer upon them the equality with European art. And of course, some 4 years ago or something, 3 years ago, even, people began to realize most of this stuff was stolen. And so there are huge debates and discussions going on about how much to give back. Some people, some indigenous peoples have demanded things back from the collections. I think everything that was demanded will go. The question of reparations is not one that anybody wants to deal with, but it's on the table. There are people who refuse to set foot in the Humboldt Forum because they think the whole thing is a colonialist thought. So let me just say that that is all very much a work in progress that a lot of people are involved in right now. I have to say that I think Germany is already a few steps further along in dealing with its colonial past than Britain, Belgium, Holland, France, precisely because Germany did have this experience of doing it with the Nazis. So they have the idea. Whereas a year ago, The Guardian did a poll that showed that only 19% of British citizens thought that there was anything wrong with the empire. And so they're moving more slowly. Those are questions, but it's, Germany, again, has some practice. We'll see how far it goes. It's very much in flux right now.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we've been talking for about an hour. If there are any final questions from the audience, I'd be happy to ask those for you. Otherwise, Susan, I'm just thinking about sort of a final note for our talk. I believe you end the book, and I didn't get through it to the end the second time, but on a hopeful note. And so I wanted your thoughts on if you are feeling hopeful, and what we can do, here at the GAI and in our community to help uplift voices, and further reading that we could do.
So I don't view hope as a feeling. I view it as a moral obligation. Okay. I think that if we don't hope, we'll always be unable to act in order to make anything in our communities better. We will fall into cynicism or despair. So the question of how I'm feeling at the moment, I mean, some days I feel better and some days I feel others differently. Some days I feel pretty down about the state of the world, but I make it kind of a rule not to speak in public and not to write or not to publish, unless I can offer some kind of orientation, unless, to say, look, there are enough people who write books that say the world is doomed and, more yesterday than tomorrow. But that strikes me as a deeply immoral way to go around in the world. So that's the first thing. Things you can do. I mean, I did mention, I really, at this particular moment in time, I think the constant murder of Black people by, representatives of the government has to be front and center. And whatever we can do about that is absolutely, the first order of business. As far as further reading, one thing, by the way, that I think Americans are better at than the Germans have been at, which is why Germans sometimes have problems dealing with Jews who don't fit into a particular picture. They don't read enough, they don't hear enough voices, they don't see enough, there are not enough films. Americans, you don't have American culture without African American culture. And I think people are more and more aware of that. But for anybody who hasn't read every single novel of Toni Morrison, you should go out and read them, And one of the great things about Morrison, I mean, there are a number of great Black writers, also in recent times. She wasn't writing for a white audience. In fact, in some of her books, she deliberately, you don't know what race somebody is or not, And I think trying to see the world through the eyes of different people is extraordinarily important. In many ways, I think popular culture is more significant than any sort of lesson plans. So, that's, I mentioned Morrison because I've always loved Morrison. There are, of course, a lot of other, wonderful African-American writers, but Baldwin, if you haven't read all of Baldwin, is, there are some people who just everything they wrote is terrific. Oh, and here's one more last suggestion that I've started to make when people ask me what they can do concretely to change Americans, perceptions of our history. Run for your school board. And if you're not prepared to run for your school board, find out who is running and support a good candidate, because those are the people who control what gets taught in American public schools. And, the right figured that out 40 years ago, that, national elections are interesting, but it's very small local elections that actually have an enormous amount of power. And that's something that we need to be paying attention to.
I'm going to show everyone your book. It is available on Amazon, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And Susan, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Germanic-American Institute and everyone who listened today. I want to thank you for being with us, but also for the very important work that you do. I'm very glad that you came out of the ivory tower to reach so many of us with your thoughts and your work. And we very much look forward to your next work. And thank you for all the speaking that you've done. I know you've been very busy around the country and around the world from your office in Berlin right now. But thank you so much. This was really interesting and very meaningful for us. So,
well, thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome.
All right, be well, and gosh, I hope things look better in Minnesota.